Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Wherever you are listening to this podcast, a warm welcome to you. Today is July the 23rd, 2018. This is our 10th podcast. Oh yeah, we have hit a milestone. So in this particular podcast, we are going to talk about rights. We are going to introduce the concept of rights, not necessarily human rights, but we're going to talk about the concept itself. We're going to address the underpinnings of the concept in terms of how rights is often described as a moral foundation for human behavior. So we're going to look at the concept. We're going to examine how there's no universality in the way the concept is understood. We're going to look at how the misunderstandings about the concept often lead to injustices, abuses, and all kinds of issues with humanity as a whole. This idea that my right is not necessarily yours, my views of what right is not necessarily your understanding of what right is, and this often creates a conflict and all kinds of issues within the human species itself. So in this particular podcast, we're going to debate that. Although this is an introductory podcast, we are going to debate a certain aspect of the concept separately. But for now, we're going to look into the concept in terms of how it is often understood, how the concept is viewed and applied in society as a whole. So without further ado, let's get to it. An interesting question I would like to ask is rights. The concept of rights. When we say rights, what is meant by that? I have to admit that an answer to this question is not that easy. An answer is not that clear or succinct. The reason is that the concept of right is understood in two different ways. The first way in which right is understood is within the context of a social construct. In that sense, rights is something that every member of society is entitled to. And that entitlement is based on the principle of morality or moral principles. In other words, that entitlement is based on the notion that every human being is worth it. Now, before I go further, I have to point out that I am not going to make the argument that human beings do not have an inherent right. This is not what this discussion is about. Rather, it is to understand the fundamental of the concept of right. What is right? When we say human rights, for instance, what do we mean? What are the connotations of that term or of that understanding or of that notion? And this is what we're going to be discussing here. Now, if we were to look at rights within the context of an entitlement, in other words, every human being is worth it on the outset. Okay? That definition would be an exclusionary definition. It would be a way of looking at rights from a way that excludes certain entities, certain living beings. Okay? and it would exclude certain groups, okay? While it includes a particular group. In this case, we're talking about humanity, or the human beings in particular. Now, I would not look at rights as one group has it, at the same time others don't have it. It is inherent for certain groups, but it is not for others. Or I would not look at the concept within the context that it only applies to X and not Z, or it applies to Y and not W, right? If we're looking at rights from this narrow lens, then we are excluding a bunch of living entities whom I would argue, have an inherent or natural right to be. Looking at rights from an entitlement standpoint is an exclusive definition, right? The same moral purview that underlies the right of a human being oftentimes undermines the rights of other human beings. The reason John has to protect his human rights is often the same reason John uses to undermine other human beings in this world. In other words, the reason I give myself to protect me oftentimes is the same reason I give myself to undermine others. And this is how the world has been built over time, where whenever you hear folks talking about human rights, you have to be very careful as to what it is that they're talking about, because usually they're talking about their rights and not the rights of others, okay? As if others were not human beings as they are. And we have to understand this is the fundamental of all inequalities, of all injustices in the world. It's this idea that my view of the world is the view of the world. And some say that God gave them this view. In other words, they are blessed in a way that they are the descendants of a particular group of people or a particular breed of people, which gives them the rights to be. Okay? And in doing so, they so exclude other groups whom, from their vantage point, from their lens, from their understanding, do not deserve or do not have the same rights as they do. And I think this is where the danger is, because we as intellectuals, as we look at the concept, we have to be careful not to fall into this false positive in terms of we're saying to ourselves that what we think the world is for us is what it is for others. And I think that's where we have to take that into account as we're trying to understand this concept. The concept of rights by itself, it's a concept that is a human construct to some extent. But underneath that construct, there is a natural construct. There's a natural understanding of what rights is. All right? So in other words, if a human being has rights, whether or not that right is acknowledged by another human being, that does not necessarily validate that right, because that right is inherent. It is natural. Another human being does not have to validate another person's right for that person to have right. And basically that's what I am saying. Okay, but when we look at rights from this exclusionary standpoint, when this narrow lens, where when we speak of human rights, we're speaking about our rights as a civilization or as a group or as an entity, we automatically exclude certain groups from that rights. Thereby, we make them irrelevant, or make their rights irrelevant, or we sort of subsume that they do not have the same rights as we have. So even though we're speaking about human rights, even though we're talking about human rights, but the way we approach the human rights, it is as if we were the only humans in the world, and anybody else, even though such an entity were similar to us in terms of shape, skin color, and whatnot, but we do not consider them as equals in terms of the way we define ourselves within our little confound, based on how we define ourselves and our understanding of what our rights are or is, or what those or such or what such rights ought to be.